today. I especially want to thank those who've had to travel a long way, like Willie Kuzel, who came down from Johannesburg, and others who have made the effort, especially people who are a little infirm and older. And we really appreciate you all being here this afternoon. Unfortunately, my mom can't be here. She would have loved to, but she's just a little bit frail and recovering from the shock of losing my dad, so she isn't here this evening. And also I'd like to say that his sister Penny would have loved to have been here. She lives in Johannesburg, but she also couldn't make the journey down. So we'd just like to think of them and wish or feel their presence with us. Dad was a remarkable man, and he led a really extraordinary life. He touched the lives of many, and he really never expected even acknowledgement or reward or thanks for many of the things that he did. He was an entrepreneur, and he had many varied interests in life. As soon as he mastered one, he would move on and start another one. And I think this was perhaps why he did so many different things with his life. Despite all his accomplishments, he remained incredibly humble. And I think that was one of the main traits of my dad, is that he never sort of showed people exactly how successful he'd been. He was always very humble about it. Dad had the most wonderful 67-year marriage to my mom. My mom Jenny. It was a true romance right to the end. My mom was amazing these past months. She put everything aside and she sat with my dad right through to the end. And I think the last coherent thing that I ever heard my dad say was, "I love you, Jenny." And I think that's an amazing thing to say. My dad was born in Harrismith to a very humble beginning, and his mom, my grandmother, told me that she knew that his dad was going to propose to her when he started to build a rondavel on the farm that he was leasing. He was living under an ox wagon at the time, and he was making mud bricks, and he built a little rondavel, and then he proposed to her, and she moved in with him. And when she was expecting my dad, they built another little mud hut next door, and they connected it with a small passage. And I always sort of wondered about that story that my grandmother told me, and whether it was really true. But very recently, going through my dad's photographs, I saw a picture of his dad holding him with his mom standing next to him in front of two little rondavels connected with a passage. So it was clearly true. My dad, the other story my grandmother told me is that when he was about 3 years of age, his dad came to her and said, "Look, we really need to make a plan with Paul. You know, he's nearly 3 years old and he can only speak Zulu. So we need to start speaking English to him." So he lived his early life, I think, was a carefree existence, roaming the mountains around Harrismith. And I think it was there that he developed his love of the outdoors and of nature. And I think he spent many happy hours climbing the Platberg just behind Harrismith. And the last time that I was in Harrismith with my dad, he took me up the Platberg, and he showed me where as a kid he used to roam around, and where he used to go up for the day, and his dad would give him 2 pellets for his pellet gun. And he had to shoot a rock pigeon and cook it, and that was his lunch. And if he didn't get one with 2 pellets, then he didn't get lunch. So, at a very young age, I think probably about 11 years of age, he was sent to boarding school in Johannesburg, to King Edward's primary school. And I can only imagine that must have been an enormous shock for him. And I know that he was very homesick, although he never really said much about it. But I think it probably made him very self-sufficient and strong. And perhaps that was one of the things that he carried through life from his experiences as a kid. He had a very successful career at school. He made the first rugby team. He was vice head of the school, and he was the head of the boarding house. He learned to play the bagpipes while he was at school, and he was the first pipe major of the King Edward's School pipe band. So, and I think that was the beginning of a great love of music for my dad. I'm sure some of you are feeling quite nervous seeing this huge sheet of paper that I've got here, but I think it's maybe more a reflection of my vision and my handwriting than the speech. So after school, Dad went on to study engineering, civil engineering at Wits University, and there he once again became involved in many different activities. He did gym, and I know that he did quite a lot of work on the horizontal bar. I think it was his favorite thing, doing gym. And he also took up climbing. And he went down to the Drakensberg when he was at university, 3 of them, and they went climbing up one of the mountains I think in the Cathedral Peak area. And when they got to the top of a particularly steep climb that they'd done with ropes, one of his friends, George, jumped off a little rock and twisted his ankle. And in twisting his ankle, he went over the cliff. And my dad watched him bounce down the cliff. And he ended up on a rock scree at the bottom. And my dad and his other friend climbed down to him, and there were bones sticking out of him all over the show. And my dad, being the fitter of the two, decided he must go for help. And it was in the afternoon, and he climbed back up, and he ran to the nearest forestry station, which was at the bottom where they started the climb. And he ran all afternoon and into the night. And he said he became so exhausted that at times he would lie down on the path and fall asleep. And then he was worried about how long he'd been asleep, and he'd leap up again, and then he'd carry on running. And eventually he got to the forestry station sometime during the night. And he told them what had happened, and he collapsed. And the next morning, the mountain club crew were there to go up and try and help his friend. And he led them back up. And his other friend had taken all his clothes off and put them on George, and had spent the night trying to warm him up with his body heat. And they managed to get him off the mountain, and George recovered and lived a very happy life. My dad never climbed again though, and he always used to warn me when I was on the mountain, don't jump off a little stone, you could easily twist your ankle and you never know where you're going to end up. After his climbing, he took up rowing, and he ended up being selected for the Wits first 8 and went down to the Buffalo Regatta to row the race that they do every year there. And he clearly had become interested in karate at that stage, which must have been quite an early sport in South Africa. And he had a book on it. My dad always started everything with a book. And he'd been practicing hitting a wall with his fist, which he said would strengthen his fist so that he could actually break things with it. And evidently he was telling his friends from the rowing team about this when they were in the hotel. And one of them asked him to demonstrate how he did this. And so he stood up and he punched the wall, not knowing that it was a dry wall. And he punched right through into the neighboring room. So I'm not sure if alcohol was involved in that, but I suspect there probably was. Anyway, they moved one of the cupboards and hid the hole and disappeared. So I don't know what the hotelier thought had happened there. There is a rumor that my dad drove from Johannesburg to Harrismith, steering only with his knees and playing an harmonica the whole way for a bet. I'm not sure how true it is, and I'm not sure whether he won the bet or not. At university, he met one of his great friends, Graham Greathead, and the two of them came down to Cape Town to Gordons Bay on a fishing holiday, and there he met my mom. She was a friend of Graham's from her childhood, and it was love at first sight. My mom was 16 and he was 19, and it became a lifelong romance and marriage. They started communicating with letters in those days, I think, and as soon as he qualified, he decided to come and get a job in Cape Town. So his first job was working for the Cape Town City Council, so that he could be near to Mom. Later, I think he realized he wasn't going to make too much money working for the Cape Town City Council, so he joined the railways, and he went up. And he had a job working for the railways in escort in Natal. And my mom stayed behind, and they got engaged by letter. I believe he sent the ring to her in the post. And after a 6-month engagement, they met up again the day before their wedding. And my mom decided she changed her mind. Anyway, there was nothing to be done, and they got married, and they went to Gordons Bay for their first night. And the next morning, my mom asked him to take her back home, so, which he did. And when he got home, she said no. She decided she didn't want to be married after all, and her parents just told her to get back in the car and go. So she ended up in escort as well, which is where Barbara was born. And while he was in escort, my dad took up playing the clarinet, and he joined a jazz band, and they played all around Natal. And my mother speaks of her deep embarrassment of when my dad would leap onto a table and belt out a clarinet solo in the middle of a party or something. My dad moved on to Bloemfontein after that, and he left the band, but I believe the band went on to become one of the top jazz bands in South Africa. Dad got a job building the Bloemfontein power station, working for LTA, and that's how I ended up being born in Bloemfontein. I wasn't there for long, thank goodness, and after Bloemfontein, he came down to Cape Town to work for Clifford Harris, and that is where my other sister, Lynn, was born, in Cape Town. She was the lucky one. While my dad was working for Clifford Harris, he was in charge of a very big job building the Settlers Way approach, sort of from Black River Parkway to, I suppose, where Hospital Bend is, where there was a huge excavation that had to be done. I don't know if you know those big concrete walls on the side. And while he was there, Sharpeville happened. And after Sharpeville, there was a big march of the people from Lunga to protest against the pass laws. And I don't know why, but my dad decided that he would go down to his site and be there when the march came past. And he stood on his site while these thousands of people walked past, and he said that as the guys that worked on his site came past, each one of them lifted their hat to him very politely, which he was always amazed about. And he was completely horrified to find out later that the leader of that march had negotiated with the police in Caledon Square that they would all march peacefully back to Lanka as long as he was allowed to speak to the minister of something. And once the march was over and everybody had marched back to Lanka, they arrested him and put him in jail and didn't ever allow him to speak to anybody. And his name was Philip Khosana, and I think it's very appropriate that that road was named after him later. At around about the time of Sharpeville, or just after Sharpeville, Clifford Harris got a bit nervous about the country and decided to fire a whole lot of his staff, and my dad was one of them. And then a couple of weeks later, he decided to rehire them, and he phoned my dad and said, no, you can have your job back. And my dad told him that he wasn't prepared to work for somebody that would fire him at the drop of a hat, and he was going to start his own construction company, which is what he did. So he started WJM Construction out of the back of his Ford station wagon. I think one of his first constructions was the Delbrook swimming pool, which he said he could never visit again because it was so poorly constructed. He said the only reason that he managed not to go bankrupt on that job was that there was a very friendly building inspector, and whenever he came and inspected the work that my dad had done, he would walk along, and when the concrete on this side was full of honeycomb, he would be looking on this side. And when the concrete on this side had been washed away by the sea, he'd be looking on that side, and he walked all the way around, and he eventually signed the thing off. My dad said it should never have been accepted. But there it is, it's still there today, and so it couldn't have been that bad. So I think my dad realized that there was a big gap in marine construction because nobody really wanted to do it. And so he got a job building this new slipway at the new Havana Harbour. And while he was there, he had a very nosy harbour master And he had to do a lot of blasting. And what they would do is they would drill a whole lot of holes in the rock, and then he would measure off safety fuse so that he put a long piece on the first piece of explosive and then shorter and shorter and shorter pieces on it, and he timed how long it would take him to walk and light them all. And then he would jump into the sort of area that they'd made where you could hide, and all the explosions would go off at the same time and create the best effect. And when he was doing one of the bigger blasts, as he was coming down lighting the explosives, he met the harbour master coming from the other side, who'd been giving him a hand and started lighting the short fuses. And he looked at this guy and said, "Run!" And both of them ran like hell, and this thing just went up in a haphazard fashion. And yeah, so I think he had some fun there. At Gansbaai, he then got a job after that to deepen the harbour at Gansbaai. And we went to live in Hermanus, where I turned 3. So I vaguely remember some of the time living in Hermanus. And while he was building the harbour in Gansbaai, or deepening the harbour in Gansbaai, he would have to dive. He was doing the diving himself and doing the drilling himself. He was about 28 years old, I would think, at that stage, 29 years old. And it was very cold, and they didn't have proper diving equipment in those days. So what my dad would do is he made a cardboard cutout of a person, and he would paint it with latex. And he'd keep on and on painting with latex until he'd made like a big sort of human-shaped condom. And then he'd put on all his warm clothes, and he'd roll this thing over himself, and then he'd go down and he'd dive in that. But he said it always leaked around, all over the show. It used to come out very wet and very cold. And my mom talks about my dad getting home from work in the evenings and sitting in a chair and shivering non-stop for hours on end, and she just couldn't get him warm again. While he was down there, or while he was working at Gansbaai, the security police visited him at 3 o'clock in the morning and took him away. There had been an explosion at the Bloemfontein railway station, and the police had worked out that the dynamite used in the explosion had come from his site in Gansbaai. And they took him in and they questioned him, and they asked him whether it was possible while he was diving that he could have lost track of the amount of explosive that was being used. And my dad said, of course it was. He couldn't really count when he was at the bottom, but the guy on the barge at the top was keeping track of how much dynamite he was using. And this was a guy called Adam, who lived in Gansbaai. So the police released my dad and promptly arrested Adam. And a few weeks later, Adam reappeared on site, which my dad thought was unlikely. And he asked Adam what had happened, and Adam said, no, well, the police had questioned him, and he'd explained to them that there were some ANC people who had threatened his family and convinced him to steal dynamite from my dad's site and give it to them. And the police had released him because they believed his story and realized that he'd been under sort of blackmail to do it. So that was another sort of close call with explosives that my dad had. After that, he got a job building all the culverts and the bridges on the new road that was being constructed between Hermanus and Stanford. And while he was working on that job, he noticed a piece of property on the lagoon. And he went to the farmer who owned it and asked him if he could rent it and build a small holiday shack next to the water, which he was allowed to do. And for a rental of 48 rands per year, and I still have the lease agreement, he was given a small piece of land that he could rent, and he built a shack that we went to from 1964 onwards. He later bought that piece of land, and it has always remained in our family as our holiday home, and we all really enjoyed going there and enjoying holidays there. Over time, WJM grew and grew and grew, and eventually in 1993, when my dad sold it, it was probably the biggest privately owned construction company in South Africa, employing around 3,500 employees. My dad started many other businesses in his life as well. One of them was Pride Pools. Dad had used gunite on the cooling towers in Bloemfontein, so he knew how the technology worked, and he read about people building gunite swimming pools in America, and he decided to do it in Cape Town. And a lot of people told him that you would never ever sell a swimming pool in Cape Town because it was too close to the sea and nobody would want a swimming pool, they'd just go to the beach. Anyway, that proved to be incorrect, and he did very well with pride pools. Later, he decided to try his hand at farming, and he started the first hydroponics greenhouse in Cape Town. He had about 4 hectares under greenhouse. It was called Oplas. He visited the Netherlands and Israel to find out how the technology all worked, and he imported the first English cucumbers into South Africa, or grew the first English cucumbers in South Africa. The cucumber that we all eat now was he brought in, and they grew tomatoes and peppers and many other things as well. He also became very interested in cycling, and he started a company called Solarped, and Solarped imported mopeds, small little motorbikes that you had to cycle on, and I think that Rick Wing will remember very well. The two of us driving these little mopeds to Hermanus on particular school holidays together. And he also sold bicycles and bicycle parts. He started the Lejeune bicycle factory in Cape Town, and of course he's really well known for the fact that he started the August tour around about that time, when he was really interested in his cycling. Yeah, so as I said, my dad would become obsessed with a new pursuit, only to move on to a new one when he had mastered it. And keeping up with him as a kid was pretty tricky, because my dad was, I think you'd call it hyperactive. I'm sure that these days, if he'd gone to school, they would have given him a good solid dose of Ritalin. And my dad found a book called the Canadian Air Force 5BX Exercise Program. And he decided that he was going to do this every morning at 5:30, and that I would join him. And for the rest of my school career, at 5:30 every morning, we would get up and we would do all these exercises that were laid out in this book. And I can tell you that there were days that I really, really didn't enjoy being at 5:30, but that was the way it worked. And after that, we'd go for a 2-kilometer run. The other things that he did in his life, he was one of the first surfers in Cape Town. He got a board from John Whitmore, and I remember as a tiny little guy waiting on the beach with my mom for my dad to come out of the water after he was surfing. And I remember even more clearly being absolutely terrified when my dad would take me out and stand me on his board, wait for a wave, give it a push, and I would stand on the board and go all the way in to the beach. And he thought that I was a really good surfer. What he didn't realize is I was absolutely terrified, and I didn't move, not an inch. I just stood there. But then he gave up surfing for sailing, and he got very into sailing little extra dinghies, and he built himself an extra. And I remember many regattas that we did all around the Cape, camping often on the beach. I remember one in particular at Mossel Bay, where these guys in these little extras all went out and sailed around, all around Mossel Bay, and all of them came in looking pretty pale and saying that there's some huge sharks out there. And those days, I don't think anybody knew about the great whites, but they'd seen them in their extras while they were racing. Dad built me a dab chick as well, and I spent some time trying to learn to sail, but it wasn't particularly successful, I'm sad to say. After sailing, he took up horse riding, and he joined the Cape Hunt and Polo Club. And he spent a lot of time chasing the hounds all over the show, all around Cape Town, on various farms. He built some stables on a property that he bought in Constantia, and spent many, many happy hours riding horses. He also took up board surfing. I think Mike Lear persuaded him to go board surfing when Mike was surfing, and he surfed, he board sailed right up until his late 50s when his shoulders gave up. I mentioned cycling. He and his great friend John Stegman did a lot of cycling together. My dad built and had recliners built and spent a lot of time cycling on these recliners. And at that time, I think we were still at school, and he was wearing this very tight lycra and stuff. And we just basically never recognized him when he was out on his bike. And it was at that time that he started the August tour, which he's so well known for. After that, he took up hiking and spent a lot of time walking in the mountains. And I think along with a lot of the guys that he's walked with more recently are here this evening. He took up restoring classic motor cars, and my dad always loved motor cars, and he would change cars quite frequently, which was always good for me because I often picked up the second-hand car when he bought the new one, so I was often I had a supply of good second-hand cars coming my way. So he restored a Daimler, he restored a Carmen Gear, and he was working to restore a Metropolitan Nash more recently. That one was unfortunately never finished. He took up painting and became an incredibly accomplished painter. There are some really beautiful paintings that he's done. One of each of our children, just about everybody in the family has a portrait. He did beautiful paintings of proteas and other wildflowers, and was really very accomplished, particularly in watercolor and pastel. He then took up carpentry, and he built some really, really beautiful pieces of furniture. One of which we have in our lounge today. That's a drinks cabinet, a glass-fronted drinks cabinet. And he built each one of his children one particularly beautiful piece of furniture as a wedding gift, and that was Leon, my wedding gift. One of Dad's great passions was Eagle's Nest. Dad discovered Eagle's Nest when he was riding horses from his property in Constantia, and he heard that it was for sale, and he bought it in 1984. He built his offices there, and he worked from there for many years, and he really loved the place. He didn't really develop it particularly. He tried his hand at growing some proteas and some kiwi fruit and a few other things. And the one thing I always remember is that he always had sweets in his office, because Lee and I and Barbara and Pete were living on the farm at the time, and he would lure his grandchildren in there every day to eat sweets, which we weren't always that happy about. In January 2000, there was a devastating fire that came through and burnt the whole of Eagle's Nest. All the forests were burnt, and my dad was actually absolutely devastated by it. He really didn't think that it would ever recover. But in the hands of Peter Stewart, it was turned into a really beautiful wine farm. And Pete, you did a fantastic job. And I think my dad just really loved seeing the farm come alive again. And he was so proud of the wine that he used to give it away profusely to anybody that he knew. In 2007, at the age of 74, my dad project managed the building of the winery at Eagle's Nest. And I remember seeing him standing there with a theodolite, taking readings, and he still had it. And he built that whole winery himself, and he did it for a lot less, I think, than it would have cost us if we'd hired somebody else to do it. My dad was a great patriarch in the kindest sense of that word. He always found a reason to get the family together, whether it be birthdays or Easter or Christmas. He made sure that there was always enough accommodation at Amanus for the whole family to get together, and sometimes 18 of us were together living on the same property over Christmas, which could get a bit hectic, but it was really wonderful that we could all be together. So in conclusion, I must say that Dad was first and foremost a gentleman. He was a loving husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, friend, and an inspiration to many people. He will be missed by all of us here today, and many others. And so I would just like you to please raise your glasses and drink a toast with us to Bill. May he rest in peace, as he so richly deserves. Bill.
No, I'm okay.
My sister Barbara is going to say a few words now, and she's standing right next to me here.